I'm joined today by Brian Terry.
Morning, everyone.
Brian is of Vlamis Software as well, and will be helping me especially in fielding questions on today, and chime in when appropriate, Brian, if there's something else to add. So we're going to go over today, we've done several webcasts. I'll go over that in just a moment, and this is in a series of webcasts. If you want to chat with us, you should have a control panel for GoToWebinar that allows you to chat with us either with the chat box, or there should be a questions panel. You can send questions to us. Brian will be helping me monitor that questions panel as items come in. And go ahead and do that. Today we're going to have a little bit of just quick background on what this is part of, and then dive into 12C migration stuff. A little bit about Vlamis Software. We founded over 20 years ago, developed all sorts of Oracle BI systems, and we specialize in Oracle-based data warehousing, business intelligence, and analytics. We present at all the major conferences. I happen to be chair of the conference chair for BIWA Summit 2014 through 2016, and you'll find all sorts of information about Vlamis.com on our website at Vlamis.com. We are also a beta tester for OBIEE 11G and 12C. This is in a series of webcasts on month-long webcasts following up from Oracle Open World. We gave a webcast on 12.2.1 new features that really focus more on the front end of OBIEE. Then several other webcasts. We're now on upgrading the webcast. This will be more on the, if you will, back end and the upgrade process. Then I also want to invite you all to December 9. We'll be talking especially on the front end things for the Oracle Data Visualization and Cloud Service live demo. And that's a service that is being launched by Oracle this week, from what I understand, is availability of this. And then we'll give a webcast next Wednesday with a demonstration of that, with a lot of the features of Visual Analyzer and Oracle Data Visualization Cloud Service. Then we'll repeat the 12.2.1 new features webcast on December 16th. So you'll find you can get more information on our website on that in the URL down below, or just follow the links from Vlamis.com. I also want to put in a quick plug for the BIWA Summit that's taking place January 26th through 28th, 2016 at the Oracle Headquarters Conference Center. And you'll get more information at www.biwasummit.org, and the session list is live. You can see a lot of the great sessions. There are a few more still to be added, but it's going to be a great lineup, including lots of hands-on labs where you can actually play with some of this technology yourself. It's a great conference. Come out and join us. All right, so with those preliminaries, let me jump into the meat of things. What we're going to go over as part of the 12C migration is just kind of an overview of things. Then we'll go through the pre-migration steps and considerations. What do you want to do before you actually start? And then the migration steps themselves. And then there's kind of three sections on the post-migration steps for OBIEE itself, those for BI Publisher, and for Essbase. There's a few extra things you do. And then we'll talk, we have a section on the OBIEE administration differences. And I'll go ahead and take the opportunity to thank Brian for putting together a lot of the slide deck material from our experiences as part of the beta program, from working with the actual live customer on the migration on this, and from once the release rolled, working with things in the beta program. So just an overview then of the entire migration process. You know, what you do is you analyze, and first thing you do is kind of look at your existing 11G system and prepare that environment in getting ready to migrate to 12C. The important thing on that is knowing what do you have in the system. You kind of almost do an audit and a cleanup of the system to cleanse some of that, kind of a spring cleaning, think of it as. You need to know what repository files do you use, what's in your WebCat. Do you want to perhaps remove some of the extra garbage that's in there that has gotten in there? And then what kind of metadata do you have, and what needs to be migrated, and what, for instance, is something you were testing with and you know, oh, we never used that, you know, since we first started. So get rid of some of that. And then what that does is you're going to end up using that as your baseline to prepare for migrating to 12C. So you need to understand, we'll go through what is migrated and how, develop a test plan to validate that migration, and then test a sample migration on just kind of what you have in your 11G system. Then you actually go through the migration and perform it so that you can actually see what it looks like. And then, as we mentioned, there's some post-migration steps. So we're going to focus especially on doing this as part of an OBIEE 12C install, although you can separate those steps out and install the software, get something working, and then decide to migrate things. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Some of the pre-migration steps you would do is you would then analyze and prepare the 11G system. You want to know things like, what's the size of the repository? What are all the objects in the BI presentation catalog? And do you actually want to migrate all of those in the presentation catalog? You know, perhaps you don't want to do that anymore and want to now no longer have some of those as part of your 12C system. You may want to also look at your existing security model and decide, do I want to migrate the existing users, or perhaps are there ways that you want to control how people sign into the system and edit some of those security model details? You know, what exists in there? As well, take an inventory of the data sources. You may have some test data sources that you used for a while and now really never made it into production. Why carry all that baggage along with you to the 12C system? You also need to know what kind of scheduled jobs do you have. These are some of the areas that you're going to want to test. In general, these things should come across, but you should know what exists in there. And then any links, especially to any external systems that you may have. How are those links handled? And you may have other people in the organization you need to ask those details of. So, and when you do that, you're going to use a baseline validation tool is a new capability in 12C that allows you to compare different instances of Oracle BI to each other. This is especially useful and was put in by Oracle, from what we understand, as a way to encourage people to migrate from one version to another. And this was pointed out as a significant problem in encouraging people to move from OBIEE 10 to OBIEE 11. And Oracle kind of learned from that situation and decided, hey, you know, people are fearful of issues they're going to run into, and they need a way to test the new environment and find out what changed and be able to make changes to accommodate changes in the user interface. And how do you do that? So what you do is you have they now have a baseline validation tool that can look at your existing OBIEE environment. Let's say that's an 11G environment, and you run against the validation tool against that, and it looks at the data, the visualizations themselves, the catalog objects, and even logical queries for those. And then it can compare that directly against the new environment and then give you a percentage match, if you will, of how much those two match up. So a very effective tool for looking at how these two environments can match up. So some of the characteristics of the baseline validation tool include it creates a baseline set of data that then you can compare from one version to another as a result of something like an upgrade or a patch or something like that. It also performs in a way to provide kind of an automated regression testing of two different Oracle BI environments. That works, by the way, within and across different versions of the software. So you can take that baseline validation tool. We'll talk about this in just a moment because it's an important part of the installation process. You can take that, the results of the tool itself back to 11, run the baseline validation tool, call that your baseline, and compare that against something that you have in 12 and give you more confidence in how the upgrade process works. This works both in Linux and in Windows, and it's a way to, as we said, instill some confidence when making changes to an environment. So the workflow, the way that works is you run that baseline against your 11G system. Then you also, in a separate run that baseline against your 12C system, and that stores that information in some files on your server. Then you run the baseline a third time to generate a report of the various differences between those two baselines. And then you may want to make some necessary adjustments based on those differences. You may find all of a sudden that some of the security has changed, for instance, and now you are seeing more data or less data than you should in this, and those will show up perhaps in some of your reports. And then you finally, once you're satisfied that you can make that transition and you're up on 12, you would establish a new baseline that would be the starting point that you can compare back to for any other patches or changes, configuration changes you make. So that baseline validation tool is an important part of what's in 12C now to give people confidence and help them ease with migration that they need to change or any configuration steps they need to do. So a little more about that. You determine how you're going to do your regression test methodologies. You need to select a sample set of analyses or dashboards that you're going to use as part of your baseline. Think of that as a branch of your web catalog, and which ones are reports are perhaps there for just informational purposes, and which ones do you want to actually have be part of this baseline, part of this regression testing. And you also want to determine how often you want to run those regression tests. You may want to run them nightly. It may be okay to just run them monthly, whatever you want to do in terms of how often you run those. Then you use BVT to run that. It is, by the way, a command line type of tool, and you can do lots with the various command line parameters. And you run this 3 times. The first time to establish a baseline against your existing system. That could be an 11G, or once you're up on 12, you'll use this to establish against your existing system in 12. The second run is after you've patched or in the new version. You run the baseline validation tool against that. And then the third time you run it is what generates the reports from taking the output from the first 2 runs and compares them and gives you what that looks like. We'll show that in just a moment. And then you iterate that as necessary to correct for anything that happened, any inconsistencies between those. And I should point out that an inconsistency between 2 versions is not necessarily something that's wrong. It may be something that purposefully you're changing. Indeed, some of the visualizations change in 12, and so of course those are going to be somewhat different. And the tool is actually smart enough to know that just, because something moved down a little bit, it's not necessarily any different, or a font change or something like that. It actually has some real smarts in it, which is pretty cool. What that looks like, if you want to know what it looks like when you're running, these are just some screenshots of running this when you're trying to establish the baseline on it, what it looks like. And so you can see it takes a little while to run. It's going to find a bunch of items when it's running in this, and the time that it takes is very much dependent on how many reports it's going to run through. So it analyzes the reports. It finds a bunch of reports. You can see that about the 3rd way down the screen, and then it's done in running those. It also looks at the logical sequel, so that it's not just the output from this, but you can look at what's the difference in how it generates the SQL against the database on this. And very useful if you want to analyze the logical sequel and see what the difference is. So what that report looks like when you come out, this is, by the way, these are screenshots from Sample App. This is a application that we use a great deal, and we have information at the end of the webcast on how you get your own copy of Sample App, so you can see what this looks like. And that will be coming out in Sample App version 5.11, which should be coming out later in December, my understanding is. So that summary comes out, and it can provide, when did it run how many reports did it run against, that type of thing. And then for each of the reports, you actually have a link to what was the output of that report. That's what all those file links are. And then you can actually run those reports yourself once you notice a difference between those two versions and investigate any kind of issues more effectively. So what does that workflow look like? So you actually start with your BI 11G production system. You then you install the BI 12C software. You install the binaries, the Fusion middleware binaries, and then you install OBIEE into those binaries, and then you copy the migration tool to the existing 11G system. So when you install BI12C, the migration tool gets installed as part of that. You then copy that migration tool back to your 11G system and run against it. It does it in a read-only fashion, so it doesn't change your 11G system. And then that produces a jar file with your bundle of all of the information. You copy that back to your 12C system and run the config tool or the migration tool to integrate the migrated objects into your 12C system. That will also end up taking and showing you the differences between the 11G instance and the 12C instance of any of your reports. Just a little more detail on that as well. When you have finished doing this, when you have done that, you can also compare 12C output against a baseline and run that directly from 12 to, for instance, allow you to use the migration tool for looking at changes that occur between your dev instance, your test instance, and your production instance, for instance. So more details then on those migration steps. When you install 12C, first thing you're going to do is ensure, typical Oracle stuff, ensure the system certification and platform prerequisites are met. So you look and say, do I have the software I need, the base operating system level stuff, that type of thing. Another thing you should know is that this does require the supported JDK is available, so the documentation spells that out, and you do need a JDK environment that's available before you start the installation. So you need Java on the machine before you start that. Then you install the Fusion middleware infrastructure. And by the way, for those that haven't caught up to this, Oracle is not using the Oracle Universal Installer for installing Fusion middleware. It's just a Java command, a jar command that ends up installing the Fusion middleware. So don't be hung up on that. Don't look for the Oracle Universal Installer. It's basically doing the same stuff behind the scenes, but the UI has changed for doing the installation. And then the BI installer then is a separate executable program, and you'll want to install OBIEE 12C in the same home as the Fusion middleware infrastructure. For those that are used to doing things separately and keeping everything separate, you'll need to put it in the same home. Otherwise, you're going to break some of the integration that Oracle has put in this. And then what that is basically running the OBIEE installation program. All that's doing at that time is laying down the OBIEE binaries into that. So we haven't configured any kind of system, anything like that. All right, so then what you do is run the migration tool. The 12C is a out-of-place migration, so it's a fresh install of the system. You're not overlaying any of your existing environments. You're not trying to just patch 11G up to 12. It is a new environment, and it needs to go into its own new set of directories. Then what you're doing, once you install that, do the installation, then you're going to copy the migration path, the migration tool from your OBIEE 12C tree to the 11G system. And we'd show you here where that lives. It's in the documentation, but in case people are curious where it lives, it's in the path that you see on the screen. Then you run the migration tool. Once you've copied it into 11G, installed it over there, there's some quick little installation instructions on that. You run the migration tool against your 11G system, and that produces a BI archive file, basically a jar, that includes all the information, all the configuration information from your 11G system, including your RPD, the entire WebCat, the security. All that information gets packaged up and put into this jar file that you are then going to transfer over to the OBIEE 12C system. That's ultimately going to be used to know what reports, if you will, do I run against the 11G environment when you do the comparison. So you copy that file over to 12C so that you can have all of that information, all that stuff from the jar file. All right, so then you end up configuring the OBIEE 12C instance. So far, all we've done is really install 12C. We have not configured it all. The 12C configuration is done with the config tool. It's config.sh, for instance, in Linux, and config.bat in Windows. So when you create this new WebLogic domain, that's what you're doing, is you're creating a WebLogic domain. You need several things. You'll see them on the screen: the domain directory, the domain name, various credentials, and the database connection information. So when you do that, also be aware that you're going to need to obviously connect to a database. This is what does the RCU connection. If you're familiar with that from 11G, that's when you run RCU. So you're going to need either a DBA account or access to a DBA that comes over and types in the appropriate passwords so that you can configure the database to contain the RCU information. So be aware of that when you run into this step. And then you're going to have a choice. In 12, they have a thing that allows you to select what initial application do you want. And there's really kind of two choices here. One is you either go with sample app, and that's from the built-in templates that come with OBIEE 12. I think of this as sample app light, and bring in that, and that way at least you have something you can run to test your configuration. Otherwise, you got OBIEE 12, you can run it, but you got nothing to run against. You got no RPD file. So you can go with that, or you can choose to use the jar file that you created with the migration tool when bringing up from 11. That jar file contains all of the configuration need, the RPD file, the WebCat, all of that, and that can be instead your initial application. So if you have already run your migration tool, I think you can see this allows you to migrate. That's how you migrate things from 11 to 12. Just make that jar file your initial application. Then the configuration wizard runs, and that produces your new OBIEE 12C instance. Now, bear in mind that if you already, lots of people install the 12 stuff just on a little test instance that initially is just a little sandbox, and then you say, hey, now that we have, and you perhaps install sample app and play with it a little bit, you can go back and with the configuration tool, you can take that 12C instance and reconfigure that to use the jar file from a migration tool, from the jar file created by the migration tool from 11G, and reconfigure that to be your new official 12C instance. You can take it that way as well. So we've gone through kind of the overview, the various pre-migration steps, what you do with that, and what the actual steps are to migrate. Now, theoretically, we've done this and we're ready to run with OBIEE, but we have some post-migration steps we have to do first. So let's go through those. So some of the post-migration steps, you have some manual operations that depend on what environment you have. You may need to migrate, for instance, some catalog groups. You may need have groups of in the catalog that have to come across. There may be also some security config settings or log configurations, those types of things from your 11G system that have to come across. As well, you'll need to look at your database connection information. That information, passwords and such, you have to bring across. You may want to bring over the configuration of usage tracking. If you're not aware of it, 11G has had usage tracking in there for quite some time. we're familiar with some of the implementations that we work on as consultants, that sometimes people don't have usage tracking turned on, and then they don't know what people are using. The usage tracking is very useful in determining what reports do people actually use, and for that matter, how long do they take, that type of thing, so that when somebody is complaining about something running too long, you can actually look at the logs and say, oh, well, you said it took a long time, but it really only took 2 minutes. Is that considered a long time in our company? And they said it took 10, and you look and no, it took only 2. So you may want to bring over those usage tracking information as well. In the BI roles, some things have changed. So for instance, there's no BI system account. So you'll probably want to change and review your BI roles as part of this and figure out how you might want to change things given some of that. It's really more in the details of that. It's not a wholesale change on this, but you'll want to review that. So consider those as post-migration steps. When it comes to BI Publisher, you'll need to migrate the BI Publisher configuration information, the scheduler jobs. You may want to bring over the history as well. You can configure the passwords for BI Publisher for your various data sources. If, for instance, you're pulling for BI Publisher, pulling directly from the data instead of pulling from the OBIEE repository. And the information on the BI Publisher upgrade tool, we list the path here. Of course, this is in the documentation as well, but just so you get a sense of what this looks like, there's a zip file that contains the BI Publisher upgrade information, and the syntax, I won't read through the slide on this, but you can run the upgrade path to the Oracle Home and on the source system, and then import that into the 12c environment. There are a few things that you want to take into account for Essbase, if that's part of what you're running against in one of your data sources. You need to configure the thread pool for Essbase. You may want to look at the, you'll need to configure the slang setting on the Essbase server. And, the standard stuff, configuring the modes, ports, cipher suites, that type of thing, and the wallets on this for the Essbase server and the clients. And then you'll need to import your certificates into the key store. This all is documented in the Essbase Database Administrator's Guide for 12.2.1, and that documentation is in the standard place. We'll have links to the documentation at the end of the webcast as well. So then we'll go through some of the administration differences on this, and then we should have time for some questions on this as well. So some things have changed in the administration of this. Startup and shutdown a little different. Indeed, we ran into this issues with running OPM and CTL on this. That's not there anymore, and there's a different location for the scripts. So now to start things, you use Start Managed WebLogic to start up things, and you can start that for your various services. This is how you start individual components of your OBIEE instance. So you use that instead of OPMN CTL to start things up and down. So that's now all incorporated under the WebLogic management framework to include all of that rather than having a separate place you start things up and down. As well, you can start the applications and stop applications for individual components. As well, Oracle is now using the WebLogic scripting tool to do that. All of that is in a single location for the WebLogic scripting tool. When you were working in previous releases in 11, you invoked WebLogic scripting tool from different locations depending on what you were doing. And I think that, for us at least, that caused some confusion. I think Oracle recognized that. And so now you just invoke WebLogic scripting tool. There's the path in Oracle Common. Under that, Common, bin, and WLST is how you start that up. So some of the other differences, the Oracle Home is now been redefined. There's no middleware home per se in this as well. The web cache is now part of the Fusion middleware instead of being a separate entity. And as well, I think this is a very welcome change that we have seen, is the moving from test to production or dev to test, that type of thing, is carried out in a different way. And that's part and parcel of this whole baseline validation tool, providing a way to migrate things from dev to test to prod instead of having to manually configure these things. There's new commands for process control and more of an emphasis on being able to do things from the command line. And I think that's something that Oracle learned, is that lots of companies are wanting to incorporate the changes that they make into their own batch command system. And with companies having ways of doing this that they want to control, it makes more sense to have this controlled via command line things. People that are administering BI really generally aren't afraid of running something in command line. There's also a single enterprise install that installs both the admin server and the managed server. The choice of doing enterprise install versus the stripped down install is no longer there. It's going to lay down both an admin server and a managed server as part of 12c. As well, you'll find that there are some changes to how things are scaled out to simplify clustering. That probably is from what we understand, is really laying down the infrastructure that Oracle needs to do a multi-tenant strategy. And that's one of the major themes in 12c, is the ability to scale out more effectively and have a multi-tenant environment and have multiple servers, multiple domains running within a single server, multiple servers running all together, and have independent access to those so that you can more effectively control. Indeed, a lot of this, from what I understand, is what Oracle is doing in effect for their own things. It's no secret that Oracle has talked a lot about cloud. That's what the C is for in 12c. And for their own cloud infrastructure, for instance, BI Cloud Services, Oracle needs an effective way of running multiple instances on one server to handle multiple customers. Once that's what they do with BICS, BI Cloud Services, is do that. So that's why you see some of these changes scaling out in many cases. It's not just for customers, it's for themselves as they manage their own cloud service. You also find there's a reorganized documentation format. Some of this actually happened in 11.119. Indeed, we have webcasts that go back and talk about the changes with the various OBIEE 11 series, including 11.119. There was some new documentation format in that, and that's extended in 12. Some of the administration differences as well, when you move between environments, dev to test to prod, the metadata, and things like the content, data model, authorization information, that's all going to require file system privileges. And so make sure that when you're doing that, that you can do that. This is all done, by the way, with the servers shut down. There's not the concept of migrating from dev to test without shutting down dev and test themselves. This is all done in offline only, but it allows you to migrate your instances from one environment to another. And when you export those, the source system is left unchanged, kind of what you would expect, but that way it's in read-only. So if you want to migrate, for instance, many people do a dev to test to prod, but then periodically you need to migrate prod back to dev and establish a new dev development baseline based on production. You can do that as well and not be concerned about polluting your production instance to do that. It does use the WebLogic scripting tool. All of that is used for the scripting of that and for doing that. And that's an emphasis that Oracle has on using WebLogic scripting tool to do all of this instead of the BI people kind of doing their own thing. They're capitalizing on the investment they have in WebLogic. Also, when you're doing this, just bear in mind that your BI deployments are going to exist in different domains. That can be used for instance, moving the system to different hardware. Perhaps you have everything in Windows in development while you're playing with it, and then you want to move it to Linux when you go into production, that type of thing. maybe different hardware, different operating system, or a different physical location of where these stuff is on various hard drives, that type of thing. So to move then from test to production, some of the options that you have is to export all of it. Perhaps all of the users' data sources are the same between the systems, or you can export just certain folder. You may want to export everything but the folder content. And maybe you would do that, for instance, for user acceptance testing purposes. You may not want to bring all the folder content across between your different environments. You can also export from like a test to prod without the connection pool credentials. It may be that the connection pools have been configured specifically for a test environment of OBIEE pointing to one instance of the Oracle database, and a production OBIEE pointing to another instance, for instance, a production instance of the Oracle database. You could then configure that so that the connection pool information does not come across. And that way, test points to test and prod points to prod. So it depends on how you want to handle that in your environment. There are options to handle those types of situations. And this is why, by the way, you want to go through some of testing this methodology of how you migrate from one instance to another instance before you're actually live, to make sure you're pointing to the right instances on all of this. So this is what it looks like to export the service instance. I won't bore you by reading through the various command line options. And that ultimately is going to create a bar file. For those that are familiar in using BI Cloud Services, this is a theme that Oracle is heading towards in having this BI archive file, a bar file that is a nice little place that you can have all of your configuration information to carry it from instance to instance. Those that have been using BI Cloud Services for the past year or so will recognize this same bar file that allows you to back things up and restore things very easily. And they're extending that now to the on-premise version of the software with BI12C. So the example from moving from test to prod, the export service instance, here's what some of the command lines might look like, for instance, to do that. And then when you import the service instance, this is what this would look like as well. You don't have to specify, obviously, as many configuration information. It just fills it in. So finally, then, the documentation has changed. One little tip in the documentation is that if you go to the Fusion middleware area for the 12C documentation, you can see they've reorganized the documentation based on kind of the tasks that you may use. That, in most cases, is very helpful. There's a whole guide, migrate, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, migrate BIEE from an 11G release. And there's a book on that you can read through the process. We've kind of gone through today what, in general, those steps look like. But a lot of the information came from reading that documentation and working through this with a specific customer. But, of course, we didn't run into all the situations you run into. There's a book right there with all the information on the migration. So you'll find that at the URL docs.oracle.com, middleware 1221 BI Suite index.html. Another thing I'll point out is one of the ways I use the documentation when I prepare for these webcasts on what's new in 12.2.1, for instance, is I look at the what's new section. And that is especially apparent if you click on the books link over on the left. I had to find this when I say, hey, what happened to the old way of looking at things? So you can click on the books link, and that allows you to look at the individual books and click on the what's new section for each one of those. So then recapping what the changes are, the OBIEE 12C technical architecture has been changed, and some of this reason is to simplify the installation process. It's actually a pretty quick install and has made it simpler to install. It's really just a three-step. You install Java, install the Fusion middleware, and then install OBIEE. It also is more aligned with what Oracle is trying to do with the Fusion middleware architecture in general. and so it fits very well with what they're doing with the rest of WebLogic and the rest of the Fusion middleware. It also has simplified migrating from earlier releases. And so now there's a lot more, it's a lot easier to migrate from an earlier release. And by establishing these baselines, and you can then have more confidence in migrating from one release to another. It provides a method by which IT departments to compare what they had in 11 against what they have in 12, instead of saying, well, I don't know, just install it and migrate, and we'll see what we end up with. And then you have the problem of, okay, who's going to sit and test all these reports and make sure that something works now in the new environment that worked before? It works in the same way and supports the same numbers. You now have a way of doing that in having a baseline, and you have a regression testing strategy that can be deployed in order to compare one environment against another. And that also simplifies your entire daily operations of that, how you handle startup and shutdown of your services when you need to do cold backups, that type of thing. That's been simplified as well. And the movement environments, you know, the whole life cycle support of moving from dev to test to prod, or whatever environments you all have in your companies, that will be handled as well. And that's some of the big differences with 12. I'll also point out that we have a method that we have as a quick start moving to 12C. If you're interested in that, shoot us an email at vlamis.com. Look at our website. We have information on migrating to 12C in our newsletter that we'd be happy to share with you. I'll also mention in that same newsletter is our series of IOUG BIWA Techcasts. And we've already gone over the new features webcast. There was a scoop session that my brother Tim and I went through on what we learned at Oracle Open World 2015. And then we're in here in the middle of this talking about upgrading from BI 11 to BI 12. And next week, if you come back at the same time, next week we'll be showcasing the Oracle Data Visualization Cloud Service. And we'll be doing that with a live demo of the new software. We're just putting to the finishing touches on that webcast. And that will especially feature Visual Analyzer, the new front end, if you will, to Oracle BI that's available. And that's what Data Visualization Cloud Service highlights. There are new features, just real quick, as well, that allow you to share the Visual Analyzer output, if you will, between various users of the system, and establish snapshots of something and allow you to look at, think of it as saving away dashboards, if you will, of those. That's the first time it's coming out is in Data Visualization Cloud Service. And then we're going to repeat the webcast, knowing that some people would have missed the 12.2.1 new features. We're going to repeat that on December 16th. So you can sign up for the webcasts and look at those at vlamis.com, papers 2015, #NovDes. And so that's what we got. Quick plug for those that came in a little bit late. We also have BIWA Summit 2016 taking place. This type of session and many others, about 100 sessions, folks, on business intelligence, data warehousing, and analytics, taking place in a 3-day conference out at Oracle headquarters. And come join us at January 26th to 28th. You can get more information at biwasummit.org, and you'll be able to see the session list of all the great sessions that are being given, generally 1-hour sessions, some half-hour sessions, and many, I think about 9 2-hour hands-on labs where you can try out the software yourself, including, of course, 12C of OBIEE. And at the conference, we expect to have Philippe Lyons that put together the sample app application, showcasing what's new in the new sample app as part of that. So it's a conference not to be missed. With that, we'll go ahead and have a little time for questions and see if we can answer those. You can get at those via the chat dialog box. You can chat them to us, or you can enter the questions directly on here, and we'll try and get to as many of these as we have time for. I'll leave up for a while these links, including the sample app link where you can get information, or I find it easier, frankly, to just Google Oracle BI sample app and the information on the OBIEE doc on this. So with that, I'm going to switch over so that Brian can help me handle any of the questions, and we'll handle that. All right, Brian, what do we have in terms of questions that we need to address on here?
We've had a few of them come through. One of them, and I actually have kind of answered to the whole crowd. So.
Oh, okay. So you included to everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
So what do we need to talk about on here? Since I've been busy talking, you've been able to look at these.
Definitely interested in some of the specifics of the baseline tool,
okay.
baseline validation tool, especially. What I know it does is it links to the before and after, or the the baseline and the future, or I guess potential release candidate to the next level, and then through that you can then visually inspect. One thing that I'm not sure that you've mentioned was there's kind of a set of thresholds.
Yeah.
That you can actually do with the baseline tool, because if you understand, you're not going to have visual fidelity down at the pixel level between 11G and 12G, or really anything that's been patched or something of that nature. So what this can do is you can kind of turn a knob, if you will, via parameters to kind of let this thing be less sensitive towards different types of deltas that it finds. So it's not going to give you a lot of noise from the fact that there's something's white and the other one's off-white or something like that. So.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking, it's one of the advantages of having this stuff live. The screenshot that I showed in the prior webcast has what that looks like, and I can show you what that baseline validation tool outputs. If I can just find this slide that I'll add to the presentation at the end. So keep on going, I'll look for that.
But anyway, that was pretty much along it, and then of course there's a question on if you're building a net new app, would you go directly to 12, or would you start using 11 and migrate? And I think the simplicity of 12 and the obvious new features along with the visual analyzer, things of that nature, I think would make it compelling to get on with the 12 bandwagon. I would agree with that. Let me expand on that.
Sure. Just like anything, if you're implementing today, I mean, if you were implementing a month ago, 2 months ago, then you really had no choice but to work with 11 for a while until 12 really came out. If you're starting now, I would actually look at using 12 on this. There's the obvious thing that people always say, well, wait until the first patch release comes out, that type of thing. I know in our testing, we found that it's actually been pretty stable.
Yeah, I think due to the fact that the beta ran pretty late, and it not only ran late, but it ran up against open world. So in getting it late, I was amazed at frankly how solid it was, and we'd actually moved a lot of old 11G environments forward, kind of experimenting around. So it was pretty good, solid software. I mean, literally, the Friday prior to open world, I was notified that afternoon that I was kicked out of the beta program because it was over, and that night on OTN, the GA code was sitting there. So it came fast. However, even in the feedback of the beta program and the message boards and whatnot, very few issues. And they were kind of nit issues, like maybe a broken link here and there, but nothing that really came across as a real major situation.
Yeah, and that's what, the caveat I have to give on this is that obviously we were not able to, test your environment. We weren't testing. We did do this with a customer that was interested in migrating, saw the reports, but we didn't run through everything. We just ran through, the basics on this. But from what we saw, it did pretty good. That's not to say that, the most important thing to you all, there's not an issue with. But we're pretty pleased with what we found on this. So yeah. What else?
That's pretty much it.
Okay. Let me see if I can bring the screen up to show you what this looks like on the results of the baseline validation tool for this. And let me look through the questions. I think you've handled most of these just by answering online, but I do want to point out one that was asked was, can we use baseline tools just to compare two 11G servers by any chance? I would think you could.
Absolutely can.
Okay. Yeah. So that's super. And we also, it's intended obviously for multiple 12C environments on this, and that's what it especially looks at. All right. Look at this. So all right, so I want to take a look at what the changes look like. Let me go ahead and share this on the screen. A little bit dangerous running through these, but hey, everything's gone so far well. This is what the verification summary looks like on, for instance, our instance. If you look at the summary of how many reports there are, what the differences were, what the missing dashboards are. This is a report that comes out from Oracle, which dashboards passed some threshold, and as Brian was saying, you can set these thresholds as to how many differences would be allowed. And then you can look at the results of the UI of this. And so this is what I especially found exciting. Here's an example of a orders and density by line of businesses, and that was considered a fail because look at the difference in the results on this. And the software baseline validation tool is actually doing a compare of the UI. Here's the output from the first snapshot. Here's the output from the second snapshot, and there are obviously differences in this, in the style of this as well as the results. And so it's 85% the same, but then you can see the data is different. If we scroll down here, we can see some of these that eventually passed. Here, this failed because CopyLink requires Adobe Flash Player. Oops, that's not what you want you users to see. That's a fail, only 3% the same. So the software is comparing these, and you can see some of these actually changed significantly, and some of these passed. So here's an example of the orders and density by employee. That's a pass, even though you notice, obviously, the blue here is different from this blue, and the style of the report is different because things change in 12C to do this. And you may say, oh, for that, that's important. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing to note as well is in using this tool, it's actually driven by an XML config file. So these different types of tests are based on plugins, which tells me a couple things. One, it's very easy to just, through your XML file, choose the test you want, but it also tells me that there'll probably be more plugins forthcoming as this evolves, so there may be more different, more expanded types of testing available. So, again, the whole thing was originally, when we were getting it introduced to us in the beta program, it's like, are my numbers right? Why does 2 + 2 equals 4 and 11 and equals, 86 and 12?
Yeah.
So something like that. So I think there was, and then the use of this tool, though, I think is remarkable potential.
So these examples that I'm showing you here actually are in the Sample App virtual machine for Sample App 511, and that's coming out very soon. If you want to see what these results look like in a VM that you can actually touch and feel, and then look at all these, you can get Sample App, and that was on that slide that I'll put up in just a minute. If you want to have environment you can look at. But this visual inspection of these, now bear in mind, if you're going to do hundreds, thousands of reports, it's going to take a while to run. And it runs the actual browser to capture these, to compare the two different visuals side by side. And this is great. I think actually this came from, as it turns out, from Oracle's QA labs, because this is how they QA the releases. And they said, why don't we make this available to various IT organizations so you can have more confidence in moving up from one environment to another. So I think this actually handles the last question I see, but if you drill on a dashboard to go to other BI content analyses, how do you visually check this? This will handle all of the catalog objects that are given on a given branch. The drill paths, from what I understand, it does not have And so you would have to make sure that where you drill to is also part of this batch line validation tool. I think it also handles the prompt area.
It'll handle
so
prompts.
You can handle prompts in that config file.
It will. The only other question that I did not have a definitive answer on, which I have not seen on, was the action framework.
Yeah. I'm not aware of a solution to that.
Sure.
If somebody that knows the answer or from Oracle happens to be online, if you can chat us the answer, we'll share it with the entire community. Sorry, through this platform we don't open up the phone lines so people can talk. Let's see if we have any other questions that have come up from folks. And I'm going to put up the information on the if you want to get sample app, that VM on there, you can look at it yourself and get that. That'll be available out there soon.
How about December?
Yeah, it's going to be out in December from what I understand.
Okay.
It's Philippe Leon's team that puts the stuff out, and we work pretty closely with them to make the stuff available, and that's what Philippe was telling me at least.
Great.
I don't see any questions that have come in. Any other questions? So I think with that, let's go ahead and close out on the webcast. We will thank everybody for joining us. We will make this session recorded. The recording of this session is available out on our website, so that if you have other people in your organization, go to Vlamis.com and follow the link to the papers and presentations, and you'll see a link out to the recording of this. And we'll thank you for all of your attendance on this. So thank you very much, everybody. Bye.